It's really heartening to have seen such a wonderful turnout these past 3 days. And to be surrounded by people again after 2 years literally feels surreal. But as you can see, we are still straddling the physical and the virtual world. One of our panelists could not be here in person, but he is joining us virtually. So we'll just try and make the best of things. To introduce myself briefly, my name is Taiba Abbas. I'm a writer and the founder of a publishing house called Ala Books and Authors. I'm joined by Osama Siddique and Musharraf Ali Farooqi at the back, but I'll be looking at him over there, so bear with me, please. These two individuals require no introduction whatsoever. Suffice to say that together they represent a formidable fusion of research, writing, translation, and publishing. Today, the three of us are going to be talking about the Getz Pharma Library of Urdu Classics, which is essentially a collection or a series of 18th century Urdu qissas, translated, edited, and published by Musharraf under the banner of his publishing house, Kitab. And just to give you a glimpse, and a really tiny glimpse for those at the back, this is the Urdu text of a certain qissa, and this is the English translation. So basically, these two books are part of the same package. So if you buy one, you have to buy the other one because it's right there in front of you. And for me, this is a very unusual and unprecedented project because, and Osama might agree with me on this, when we think of translation, it's a process that is separated by or divided by place and time. So there'll be someone who picks up a book miles away in another country and will translate it into another language, into another culture, and take it to another part of the world. But this project is being conducted within a very specific space with a very focal creative vision. So, Musharraf, I would like to begin with you taking us through the inception of this project.
Thank you, Taiba, and thank you, Osama, and thank you, everyone, joining us here this afternoon. The Getz Pharma Library for the Classics was launched this year, and the mandate is to publish 6 qissas in Urdu, along with their 6 English language translations every year. So with year 1 completed, we have 12 titles, 12 in Urdu, 12 in English. Getz Pharma, as many of you might know, is a pharmaceutical company that's heavily invested in cultural preservation, education, and social improvement. And this was a project very close to Mr. Khalid Mahmood's heart. He knew about my work. He's been very supportive always. And when I approached him with this idea for the Getz Pharma Library for the Classics, he immediately signed on, and we are here today discussing the fruits of that venture. These classics represent some of the best known stories. Not just these classics that have been published, but those which are going to come in the coming years. They represent some of the best known stories from Indo-Pak subcontinent. And these were the stories that were not only narrated in the oral tradition, they were also written and published in scores of editions in thousands of copies, which are scattered today all over the world in different museum libraries. Unfortunately, in early 20th century, we lost our connection with our classics on the pretext of many things, on the pretext of modernity, on the pretext of practicality, on the pretext of having a more meaningful connection with reality through literature. So these were some of the, broadly speaking, these are some of the points which caused us to lose our link to our classics. And although this link is not completely severed, we have many people working in small silos, producing books in small amounts every 5 years, 6 years. But there is no concerted effort, there is no platform under which these works have been focused on in a very dynamic sense, with not just the Urdu language text, but also the English language editions, to reach out and engage the wider world with our classics.
Thank you. I'm glad you spoke about that momentary loss of connection with, our literature. Because Osama, now coming to you as a reader and as someone who has read all these qissas, not just all 6, but all 12, the Urdu texts and the English translations. Now, for my part, as a reader, what I cherished the most was a revival of a sense of pride. Not the revival of these stories as such, because stories are there. They've always been there. They are not defined by time. I mean, people come and go, but stories are immortal, So what I felt was, or what I regained, was a sense of pride for something that we, as South Asians, tend to take for granted. And that's the fact that South Asia, this part of the world, was the seat of a tradition of storytelling that made its way to the rest of the world and shaped the West immensely. Yes. Now, the Alif Layla and the Arabian Nights played a huge role in shaping the progression of the short story in Europe, especially when French translations of the Arabian Nights reached Europe in the 18th century. Because, the Arabian Nights with the frame narratives and those endless fables, I mean, it's a treasure trove of thematic content and method and structure, But the Arabian Nights trace their roots to a storytelling tradition that was present in early Sanskrit literature. And that Sanskrit literature had, interestingly, already reached Europe in the 11th century through travel, through translation. And then, after 300 years, you have people like Chaucer, Boccaccio, literally the parents of European literature, opening incredible avenues of storytelling and prose writing, which had already happened here. So, it all comes full circle. But the celebration of that kind of plurality and, the understanding of the horizontal root of literature is something we've forgotten.
अगर आप इजाज़त दें तो मैं थोड़ी गुफ्तगू उर्दू में भी करूँगा बीच में, चूँकि हम उर्दू के किस्सों का जिक्र कर रहे हैं। मेरे ख्याल में यहाँ कोई फॉरेनर मेहमान नहीं है जो उर्दू ना समझते हों। जहाँ मेरी तकनीकी ज़ुबान ख़त्म हो जाएगी, मैं वहाँ अंग्रेज़ी का सहारा लूँगा। ये कॉलोनियलिटी का एक नतीजा है। देखिए, आपने बिल्कुल दुरुस्त बात की। मैं बल्कि उसमें एक चीज़ और ऐड करूँ ताकि ये तासुर पैदा ना हो कि हम जो चीज़ करते हैं उसमें ये कहना चाहते हैं कि हम सबसे अजीम हैं। ये मकसद नहीं है। हाँ, ये ज़रूर है कि यहाँ बहुत कमाल की चीज़ें हुई हैं, और अगर हम अपनी कहानी ख़ुद नहीं सुनेंगे और ख़ुद नहीं सुनाएंगे तो कोई और हमारी कहानी कौन सुनेगा, हमारी बात भी क्यों सुनेगा। अगर आप अलिफ लैला को देखें तो उसमें कुछ किस्से और कुछ वाक़यात ऐसे हैं जो कि ओडिसी में भी हैं। सो इसका मतलब है कि अलिफ लैला ने भी बोरो किया, और इसमें कोई हर्ज नहीं है। इंसानी कहानियाँ एक दूसरे से मुंसलिक हैं, इंसानी सकाफ़तें एक दूसरे से मुंसलिक हैं। इससे तो हम यही सीखते हैं कि ये जो इंसानी तहज़ीब है ये हमारा एक मुश्तरका असासा है। अब आते हैं इन किस्सों की तरफ। तो मेरा ये ख़्याल है कि ये जो प्रोजेक्ट है जो गेट्स फार्मा ने फ़ाइनेंस किया है, और प्रोजेक्ट की खुशकिस्मती है कि मुशर्रफ उसको चला रहे हैं, चूँकि जितनी उनके दिल में इसके लिए एहसास भी है और जितनी उनकी महारत है कम लोगों की है, बल्कि शायद और कम ही लोगों का नाम जहन में आता है। तो ये सिर्फ ज़ुबान को दोबारा से उजागर करने के लिए नहीं है, वो तो है ही है, और जब आगे हमें मौका मिलेगा तो जो मुख्तलिफ़ कहानियों में ज़ुबान का जो डाइवर्सिटी है जो उसमें, उसकी भी बात करेंगे। ये इसलिए अहम है कि ये एक सकाफ़ती प्रोजेक्ट है। एक ज़ुबान एक पूरी सकाफ़त, एक पूरी तहज़ीब, एक पूरे अखलाक की अलमबरदार होती है। जब हम कई दफ़ा ये सवाल अपने आप से पूछते हैं कि हम कौन हैं और हम कौन से अतवार अपनाएं, और वो अतवार सारी दुनिया से हम ले सकते हैं, तो उन अतवार को ना याद रखने की एक बहुत बड़ी वजह है कि हम अपनी कहानी से, अच्छा दूसरा फ्रॉम अ प्योरली लिटरेरी स्टैंड पॉइंट, यू आर अ राइटर, आई एम अ राइटर, what makes it incredibly significant is that which writing traditions are influencing us. Now consciously and subconsciously the Urdu, Masnavi, Qissa and Dastan tradition has always inspired me, has always interested me. Alif Laila has always fascinated me. And I think there may be deeper psychological, sociological reasons for that as well. Maybe we live in incredibly multi-tiered and complex societies which can only be told stories about in the Alif Laila frame within frame within frame kind of a. So I think there's a lot to be said here. So I think this is a project to rejoice, not only because it revives that entire debate on owning your culture, but also I think it's brought to you some really fascinating stories. Mind you, some of them are stories which jarred my modern sensibility. But that's okay, they're stories. I mean, there are lots of things in Western literature which have become dated according to modern normative frameworks. And then there are stories which are morally ambiguous or remarkably modern in their outlook. So that also shows that you cannot typecast the past literature. There's a lot of diversity there.
अब ये एक और दिलचस्प बात है that this kind of literature, you know, engenders so many conversations. I mean, the point Osama just brought up so skillfully, language, कि जी उर्दू में बात करें, English में बात करें. And I remember when, you know, we were putting together the idea for this talk, that was a primary concern. बात उर्दू में करें, English में करें, you know, where is the authentic expression? But the funny thing is, language can be a very unforgiving place. It can be a very hostile place, you know, like a bit of a straitjacket. Are you being true to your cultural heritage, or are you being a turncoat? अच्छा पंजाबी में बात कर रहे हैं, सराइकी में क्यों नहीं? पश्तो में बात कर रहे हैं, फारसी में क्यों नहीं? You can't really appease anyone. So because the truth is we all live on the brink of languages. And I think that makes people uncomfortable because people perhaps feel comfortable with categorization, I suppose. So yes, on one hand, language is a tough place to navigate, but it's also, I mean, as writers and on a personal level too, but I feel it's also a place of immense magic and discovery. Because language exists through people. It is filtered through people. And everyone has a unique experience of language, you know, and there's richness in a hyphenated self. कि जी पंजाबी भी है, इंग्लिश भी है, पश्तो भी है, सराइकी भी है, और कुछ और, कोई और ज़बान, किसी और ज़बान का नाम ले लें. So, now Musharraf, going back to you, as a translator, what's your experience of language, and on a personal level too?
जी तैबा, as a translator, उर्दू क्लासिक्स को तर्जुमा करना शुरू में बहुत मुश्किल लगा. जब दास्तान मीर हमज़ा में तर्जुमा करने बैठा, तो there was no oral narrative that had been translated into Urdu. फारसी में शाहनामा की कई ट्रांसलेशन हो चुके हैं, अरबी में, अरबी से अरेबियन नाइट से कई तर्जुमे हो चुके हैं, अंग्रेज़ी में. तो अगर कोई आज उनको तर्जुमा करने बैठता है, तो उनके पास एक तरह का मॉडल है कि अरबी को किस तरह से उर्दू में या किस तरह से अंग्रेज़ी में कन्वर्ट करना है, या फ़ारसी को किस तरह से अंग्रेज़ी इडियम में लाना है. लेकिन उर्दू क्लासिक्स जो हमारे किस्से और दास्तानें हैं, इनकी ज़ुबान एक तो मुश्किल है. आज बहुत सारे अल्फाज हैं जो नामानूस हैं हमारे लिए, और इसके अलावा इनमें हमारे पास कोई मॉडल्स उस तरह के नहीं हैं. तो शुरू में मुझे थोड़ी सी दिक्कत हुई कि किस तरह इस ज़ुबान को एक सीधी सी अंग्रेज़ी में लिखना तो ठीक है, लेकिन जिसमें आपको थोड़ी सी उर्दू का भी मज़ा है उसके अंदर. जिस तरह वो लोग कहते हैं कि एडवर्ड लेन के ट्रांसलेशन के अंदर अरबी का आहंग सुनाई देता है. तो this was something I tried to attempt in my translations and I still do. तो एक तो ये है कि capturing the sounds of the language, the essence of the language or the idiom or the, you know, the way a language communicates in another language. So it's not just translating word after word and stringing them in phrases and in a intelligible way. It's also how the language communicates itself, and you try to capture that into the target language, which was English in this case. So this was my main concern. Another thing is that I feel that with English being the bridge language for so many cultures, it will be much simpler for others to find, if they like any of these stories, to attempt a translation into their language from the English version.
Osama, would you like to add to that?
देखिए तर्जुमे पे तो माहिर आदमी जो है वो बोल चुका है, तो वैसे तो वकीलों को आदत होती है कि हर चीज़ का अदालत में जवाब दे देते हैं, लेकिन मैं खामोशी इख्तियार करूँगा ताकि मेरे से आप कोई और सवाल पूछें.
So back to the translation conundrum. When you have these two, when you have such texts together, there's going to be dialogue between the texts. But there's going to be, I mean, there could be synergy, but there could be a clash as well. Because when you're translating a classical Urdu piece into English, you are essentially appropriating a new cultural idiom. You are inhabiting a new social sensibility, a new social reality, even if it's imagined. Ab ye dekhein, I mean, I can't really use this example because this is not the text I'm going to be talking about, but there is a certain kissa in this series called Kissa Shehzadi Farhanda Ka. That's the Urdu title. Very straight. Yes, thank you. This is the English one. Urdu to nahi. Okay. So Kissa Shehzadi Farhanda Ka. A very straightforward title. Ab the English version is The Ingenious Farhanda and the Two Conditions. You already see a big gap. There's a big difference. Ab Urdu version mein, Farhanda's social role is emphasized. She's a Shehzadi, she's a princess. So in a minute, you can tell that the social order is the protagonist. Or English version mein, The Ingenious Farhanda and the Two Conditions, immediately her individuality jumps out at you. You know, she's a person before anything else. Shehzadi ko to bhool hi jaye. There's no mention over there. That's immaterial almost. And when you do read the kissa, you will realize that on your own. And so, the Ingenious Farhanda and the Two Conditions. She has a personality, she has unique traits, she's ingenious. So you can tell there are feminist undertones at work in the English version. So, we seem to have lost Musharraf's connection. Yes. But in the meantime, Osama, I will have to revert this question to you. Do you think that in this regard, I mean, given this example, that translation ends up becoming an act of rewriting a text?
It does, and there's nothing wrong with it. Now, what can also happen is that Musharraf thought, although he should answer this, but I'm speculating. What he thought was that what is the core hook or the real sort of intriguing part of this story is what should be highlighted in the title. Because जब आप कहते हैं किस्सा फरगंदा का, तो इस तरह के बहुत से किस्से हैं, लेकिन ये एक ज़रा मुख्तलिफ सा किस्सा है और उसमें जो ingenious nature of फरगंदा वाकई बहुत अहम है. So it could be a completely marketing decision that this is something, or it could be a completely, you know, it is a feminist decision. So all said and done, he's trying to give agency to Farhanda even in the title. And that's fine, because I think texts are always open textured and they can be interpreted in different ways. The question arises, what's the boundary? Where can you take a translation where it actually comes up with a very different connotation? And that can happen. That can happen either because you have a different or an inadequate understanding of that term, or that can happen because it's deliberate. I think in this case it is very deliberate, And the idea here is both political, although I could be wrong, as it is a purely sort of how to pitch the story in its most exciting form.
Okay, I'm back.
Oh, he's back. How much did you miss? How much do I need to repeat?
I basically ascribed a lot of problematic things to you.
I missed your entire question, Taiba, I'm afraid.
आप मुझे सिर्फ ये बताएं. Do you think the act of translation, the process of translation, becomes an act of retelling a text? And now we'll judge you on your answer, because Osama gave a very compact answer.
Not in my case, because my effort is always to capture, even with slight inaccuracies in the main text, to capture the original. Because over the years, my first impulse when I first encountered classical texts was to correct them and edit them slightly for them to make sense. But I've realized that this small breaks in the classical tradition, where sometimes a thing is left unsaid or is not fully communicated, we cannot fill in those gaps, because that's part of the oral tradition. That's how it was received. That's how it has continued. And filling those gaps now will create problems in the future when scholars find different manuscripts and try to connect the links where one thing was broken or one thing was missing. So I become very careful about making any changes to the text, but I try to interpret the text as much as I can when I'm in my mind, to create some kind of theory for that story, how that theory can be explained to a reader, to a modern reader, or for my own sake. If I'm writing the poetics of the Urdu qissas, it's a project that's dear to me and I think about it often. If I'm trying to explain or trying to create a theory of the qissas, what the narrative of the qissas is all about, I have to think about it critically while translating, and it offers a great opportunity because you're working so closely with the text. I
think his screen has frozen. So, in the meantime, my next question would be for both of you, but Osama, you can begin. According to you, what place does this kind of literature have in a global literary milieu that keeps gravitating towards English and global representation?
देखिए, इसकी अहमियत तो कई लेवल्स पे है. एक तो हर खित्ते की कहानी का एक ख़ास मिजाज होता है. सो ये नहीं आप कह सकते कि अब मुझे तो हमेशा महसूस हुआ है कि जब मैं लातीनी अमेरिका का लिटरेचर पढ़ता हूँ या मैं अफ्रीका का पढ़ता हूँ या जापान का पढ़ता हूँ, तो जाहिर है सकाफ़त और तारीख़ की जो बहुत सी चीज़ें मुख्तलिफ हैं उसकी वजह से ख़ास उसका मिजाज होता है. हमारे अदब का एक ख़ास मिजाज है. अगर उसको हम, और कई मिजाज हैं, एक नहीं है, कई मिजाज हैं जो मखसूस हैं, उसमें कई चीज़ें मिलती भी हैं. मसलन मैंने टेल ऑफ गैंजी का जब उर्दू तर्जमा पढ़ना शुरू किया, जो मशहूर जापानी नावल है, या उसको आप वैसे भी पढ़ें तो उसको आप, मुझे बड़ी हैरत हुई पहली दफ़ा ये देख के कि उसमें कई किरदार आपस में बातचीत करते हुए शेर पढ़ते हैं. बरजस्ता किस्म का एक शेर और उसका जवाब भी शेर, जो हम अपने यहाँ से मंसूब करते हैं कि यहाँ पे चूँकि बैतबाजी भी होती है, तो ये एक मुश्तरक चीज़ थी. लेकिन बहरहाल ये एक ऐसी चीज़ है जो आपको बहुत सी ट्रेडिशंस में नहीं मिलती. तो एक तो ये है कि जब आप रिवाइव करते हैं यहाँ के लिटरेचर को, तो उसमें बहुत सी चीज़ें आप ऐसी सामने लेके आते हैं जो मखसूस आपके अदब की हैं. सो आप फिर ग्लोबल जो रज़वा ऑफ लिटरेचर है उसको एनरिच कर रहे हैं. दूसरा मेरा ख़्याल में हमारी अपनी खुद एतमादी के लिए बड़ा ज़रूरी है. देखें 19वीं सदी में, और डॉक्टर नईम यहाँ बैठे हुए, इन्होंने तो इस पर काम भी बहुत ज़्यादा किया है कि जो कलोनियल ईरा का इन्फ्लुएंस है उर्दू नावल पे, और फिर नावल की सनफ जब यहाँ पे आई और पहले दास्तान थी और शायरी थी, और जब नावल और अफसाना आया, अक्सर ये बात होती है उर्दू अदब में बड़ा नावल क्यों नहीं है. पहले तो ये सवाल ही बड़ा अजीब सा सवाल है कि बड़े की क्या डेफिनेशन है, किसके लिए बड़ा. और तो मेरा तो ख्याल में उर्दू में बहुत अच्छी चीज़ें और बाकी ज़ुबानों में भी लिखी गई हैं. और दूसरी बात ये है कि इसका मतलब है कि हम जो फॉर्म्स यूज़ करते थे, कोई वजह थी ना कि वो यूज़ करते हैं. अच्छा, वो मॉडर्निटी और ट्रेडिशन और मॉडर्निटी और एंटी मॉडर्निटी की जो डायकोटमीज़ हैं कई दफ़ा बड़ी अनरियलिस्टिक होती हैं, हर चीज़ को वो कैप्चर नहीं करती. तो मेरा ये ख्याल है कि इससे हमारा जो सकाफ़ती सियासी मुकालमा है, डायलॉग है, वो भी एनरिच होता है जब आप देखते हैं कि अच्छा 18वीं सदी 19वीं सदी के सोशल एटीट्यूड्स क्या हैं. उस ज़माने में कौन लोग सो कॉल्ड प्रोग्रेसिव बातें कर रहे हैं, कौन सी तबकाती जंग चल रही है। तो आप इन डिस्कोर्सेस के बगैर कोई माशरा तो बना नहीं सकते। और अगर आपने डिस्कोर्स अपना शुरू करना है सिर्फ उस सन से जब अंग्रेज़ ने आके आप पे मेहरबानी की और आपकी कुछ किताबें दोबारा छापी और उसका तर्जमा करवाया, तो फिर तो बड़ी ही एक अफसोसनाक सूरत हाल है। चूँकि हमें तो इससे हज़ारों साल पुराने टेक्स्ट भी हमारे पास हैं, चाहे वो टेक्सला में लिखा हुआ स्टेट क्राफ्ट का टेक्स्ट हो जो कौटिल्या ने लिखा है। तो हम द प्रिंस से बात शुरू करते हैं। हम तो किताबुल वो जो 11वीं सदी का टेक्स्ट है अरबी, क्या नाम है उसका, जो कि स्टेट क्राफ्ट पे है, उसका जिक्र भी नहीं करते। तो isn't that incredibly intellectually impoverished of us to carry on doing that? So I look upon these books at multiple levels in terms of trying to enrich the discourse.
So while we still have you, I'm going to take advantage of that. I will repeat my question if you missed it. So as readers and writers, we live in a global literary milieu that keeps gravitating towards English. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's just the uncomfortable reality out there. And we're all guilty of it or not guilty of it. So given that literary landscape, I mean, if that global representation is what we desire as writers, I mean, we want to be read, we want our stories to be heard. According to you, what place does this regional literature have in that literary landscape?
So these stories are the earliest stories, because these stories are some of the literature which was translated from the oral tradition for the first time through technology, lithography, and they were printed as books. And until then, all these stories were in oral tradition, told by qissa goes, dastan goes, and kahani sunane wala everywhere. Because we cannot put an exact date on these stories, where they began or who first told them. We can only tell, this edition was published in 1875, so this is the first edition, but actually that's not the first edition of the book in that sense, because it's a much older oral text. These stories are the foundational stories of our literature. I look upon them as foundational texts, in which we can look for archetypes, in which we can look for the kind of characters we have, in which we can look at how the narrative isolates the fate of these six characters, these six central characters who are the central characters. These are the protagonists of the six qissas that we have out now. And we can compare it with a much
I guess we'll have to wait till he comes back.
older and bigger text,
Back.
larger narrative, like Dastan-e-Mir Hamza.
Okay. So, can you hear me, or is your screen
Yes.
frozen?
Yes, I can hear you.
Totally lost in translation, yes. So, and lost in connection, absolutely. And I will speed up the questions because I am very wary of losing the connection again. So in case any of you have questions, please keep them ready. So this is something we simply cannot deny. English translations open up regional texts, regional literature to a global audience. I mean, that's precisely how we've received the greatest literature in the world. I mean, French literature, Russian literature, it's all been through translation, right? But my question is, what do you think? Is this, if English translations gain more currency, gain more popularity, is that a drawback for Urdu as a literary language, or is it a benefit?
It's certainly a benefit. It's our attitude that will determine whether it's a drawback or an advantage.
Osama,
It's our attitude, rather. it's our attitude towards our own literature that will determine that, because just like a child exposed to multiple languages at an early age can become fluent in all of them, we can become engaged with world literature through English, and nothing is stopping us from exploring our own literature. But if we do that at the cost of our literature, then there is a problem, and that problem only lies with attitude. It has nothing to do with the strength and the vivacity of the literature that we have.
Osama, yes. No.
अब आ रही है. सो मेरा सिनिकल रिस्पॉन्स ये है कि महकूम माशरों में कई दफ़ा जब अंग्रेज़ी में आपका उर्दू का अदब ट्रांसलेट हो जाए तो लोग उर्दू में भी पढ़ना शुरू कर देते हैं. एक तो ये है. लेकिन लेस सिनिकल व्यू ये है कि मैं मुशर्रफ से मुत्तफ़िक हूँ, आपका अदब अगर दूसरी ज़ुबान में बाकी दुनिया के लोग पढ़ते हैं तो वो अदब जो है उसको ज़्यादा अहमियत दी जाएगी, उसकी वजह से उसके ऊपर लोग मकाले लिखेंगे, काम करेंगे, बाहर की यूनिवर्सिटियों में वो पढ़ाया जाएगा, जिसकी वजह से आपको उस अदब को और उसके लिखने वालों को उजागर करने के लिए और फंड्स भी मिलेंगे, मौके भी मिलेंगे. तो गुमनामी कभी भी कोई इतनी ख़ास अच्छी चीज़ नहीं होती अनलेस कि आपको वो पसंद है कि मैं गुमनाम रहूँ. तो शोहरत जो है उसमें कोई मुज़ायका नहीं है, जैसा कि मुशर्रफ ने कहा, आप इसको कैसे इस्तेमाल करें. अभी अगर हमारे पास वक्त हुआ और आप इस मौजू की तरफ आई कि ये कहानियाँ क्यों ट्रैक्शन ले सकती हैं, चूँकि सवाल पैदा होता है ना कि ठीक है ये तो किस्से बहुत हमने सुन लिए, कोई जिन होगा, कोई परी होगी, तो इनमें कोई क्या ऐसी ख़ास बात है कि ये एक आलमी अदब या एक आलमी रीडरशिप तक पहुँच सकते हैं. तो मेरे ख्याल में उस पर भी हमें थोड़ी बात करनी चाहिए.
But उससे पहले, if there are any questions in the audience, because I really don't want to lose this connection. Anyone? Oh, wonderful. Mic उधर दे दें. हाँ जी.
Hello. Can you guys hear me?
No.
Hello. Now my voice is audible to everyone.
A little louder,
I think I'll
please.
stand. So my question basically is that throughout your conversation, what I could gauge from this was that there's this constant sort of narrative building between the idea of oral tradition and in terms of reviving something or revising something. So as a translator, what's the actual authentic job linking to the oral tradition that you have of the region and being able to revive something rather than revise it wholeheartedly? So what does a translator do in that case? That would be...
Musharraf, could you hear the question?
Gee, I could. So the role of a translator, as I had explained briefly earlier, was that I try to remain as faithful to the text as possible. I do not try to complicate it by filling in the gaps or try to explain things where no explanation is needed. I also try to find an equivalent idiom in the English language in which that phrase or that sentence or a passage can be translated without becoming cumbersome. Yes, because it is an old text, it has to sound a certain way, and words with which we are mostly not familiar are not familiar also in the English language because their equivalent words are also out of experience. So a lot of the time when I use a certain turn of phrase or translate something as a word in English, and that English word is also unknown to us, it is because the world has changed. And a lot of the furniture of these phrases is no longer to us today around us. So that's one thing. But to finish my comment, I have to make sure that when a modern reader is reading these texts, there should be some sort of gloss or a footnote or an introduction that places that that story within its period, tries to isolate certain features that are of interest to me as a storyteller and a writer. So this is all I can do, and with engagement, as we have discovered, Taiba has reviewed these qissas and other friends, Osama is working on his reviews of the qissas, and all their thoughts create a kind of dialogue for me as a translator, which helps me look at these texts anew as they offer their interpretation of these texts. Which is, the purpose of this, to bring this back into public consciousness.
Would you like to add to that? Any other questions from the audience? आपको माइक दे देते हैं?
इन किस्सों ये तो मेरा ख्याल इस पे बात हमें करनी चाहिए, जैसे कि आपने अभी कहा कि हमें ये मौजूद छेड़ना जो है
मैं तो सिर्फ ये गुजारिश करना चाह रहा था कि चूंकि
और इससे थोड़ा सा जायका अगर हमें महसूस हो जाए तो
और हम अभी तक किस्सों के बारे में एक एब्स्ट्रैक्ट लेवल पे बात कर रहे हैं, तो ये किस्से हैं क्या? मैं आपको कहानी ज़ाहिर है नहीं बताऊंगा चूँकि वो तो आप खुद पढ़ेंगे, लेकिन ये बड़े मुतफर्रिक हैं। सो इसमें एक जो मेरा पसंदीदा किस्सा है जो काफ़ी मुख्तसर है, वो है किस्सा औरत डल्ला। बड़ा अजीब सा नाम है और ये एक पुराना किस्सा है और इसकी जो तर्जुमा अंग्रेज़ी में हुआ है, इसका टाइटल है द एडवेंचर्स ऑफ अ ट्रिक्स्टर वुमन। तो जस्ट टू वेट योर एपेटाइट, दिस इज़ वन ऑफ द मोस्ट फैसिनेटिंग कैरेक्टर्स आई हैव रेड अबाउट, सो आई एम पर्सनली ग्रेटफुल। और मैंने मुशर्रफ से फ़ौरन फरमाइश की कि मुझे आप ये बताएं कि और भी हैं इनकी कहानियाँ, तो उन्होंने कहा कि इनका तो एक बहुत लंबा किस्सा है और ये बड़ा पुराना इनकी एक वो है। अब ये खातून है जो अयारा है और जो अपने प्रॉफिट के लिए हर वक्त लोगों को धोखा देती है, और इसको अगर हम उस लेंस से अभी ना देखें कि औरत के किरदार को कैसे दिखाया है, कहानी के तौर पे देखें, तो वो एक कमाल किरदार है। चूँकि उस पर एडवर्सिटी आती है तो उसको फ़र्क ही कोई नहीं पड़ता, वो ऐसे आराम से मामले को सेटल करके अपना मालो असबाब लेके वहाँ से गायब होके 2 महीने जो है ना छुप के उसके बाद दोबारा अपनी कार्रवाई शुरू कर देती है। बट इट्स अ लवली स्टोरी एंड आई थिंक इट्स अ स्टोरी विच कैन बी रेड एट मल्टीपल लेवल्स। अब ये एक और कहानी से बिल्कुल मुख्तलिफ है जो मुझे बहुत पसंद है, जो है किस्सा छबेली भटियारी, छबेली दी इन कीपर। Now all that I'll say here is that this is a story of great moral ambiguity, because you can look at this story from the point of view of Chabeli or from another woman or from another man, and the outcome turns out to be very different in terms of how you judge people. Also, I think this is an amazing story discussing class and birthright and privilege and how that can really discriminate. So remarkably interesting for its time. Then we have the adventures of a soldier, किस्सा सिपाही ज़ादा। ये अब वर्स में है, ये नज़म की शक्ल में है, तो एक तो उसके अंदर उर्दू में रवानी बहुत है और मुशर्रफ ने उसका तर्जुमा प्रोज़ में हालांकि किया, लेकिन उसमें लिरिसिज्म है। अब ये बड़ा प्लेफुल है, इसके अंदर शरारत है, इसके अंदर धोखा दही भी है, ठग भी हैं, इसके अंदर रिवेंज भी है, लेकिन इन अ मच मोर प्लेफुल फैशन। अच्छा, उसके बाद हमारे पास है किस्सा मकतूल जफ़ा। अब ये जो कहानी है ये एक और तरह की कहानी है जिसके अंदर एक मॉरल लेसन है जो कि नॉर्मली आपको नहीं मिल रहा। कहानी फॉर द सेक ऑफ कहानी है, बट यहाँ एक मॉरल लेसन है बोस्टफुलनेस के ख़िलाफ़, कि किस तरह से आपकी वेल इंटेंशनड बोस्टफुलनेस भी आपको नुकसान पहुँचाती है और उसमें अनइंटेंडेड कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस होते हैं। और उसमें जो किरदार दिखाया गया औरत का वो बहुत एक आला किरदार और मजबूत किरदार है। सो औरतों के किरदार बड़े मजबूत हैं, चाहे अयारा हो, चाहे वो बैस्टियन ऑफ इनक्रेडिबली सॉर्ट ऑफ हाई वर्चूज़ के साथ साथ इंतहाई एस्ट्यूट हो। अच्छा, उसके बाद है जी किस्सा आज़र शाह एंड समन रुख बानो, जो कि काफ़ी मोटा किस्सा है, ये बाकी ज़रा मुख्तसर हैं। अच्छा, इसके अंदर आपको बहुत ज़्यादा अलिफ लैलवी रंग नज़र आता है, बाकियों में नहीं आता। इसके अंदर फ्रेम के अंदर फ्रेम है, इसके अंदर वो जो शहरज़ाद और बादशाह का सारा जो जेलसी का मसला है और वो जो इनफिडेलिटी का मसला है वो नज़र आता है। इसमें ज़रा ब्रूटैलिटी भी है। सो फ्रैंकली स्पीकिंग जब मैंने किस्सा पढ़ा तो मुझे थोड़ा सा नागवार गुजरा, लेकिन कहानी के तौर पे बहरहाल दिलचस्प है, बिल्कुल मुख्तलिफ है। और छठा वो है जो आपका पसंदीदा है, जो मैंने आपको भी पकड़ाया था, जो कि इंजीनियस फ़रखंदा का है, और उसमें वाकई वो बहुत इंजीनियस है और उसमें ज़ाहिर एक ऐसे किरदार को दिखाया गया जो कन्फॉर्म नहीं कर रही है इस्टेब्लिश ऑर्डर ऑफ थिंग्स में कि औरत को ये करना चाहिए, और वो बड़े तरीके से अल्टीमेटली जो भी वो करती है नहीं करती, लेकिन बड़ी चालाकी से और तरीके से वो मामले को सुलझा के और अपना इंटरेस्ट उसमें वॉच करके वो एक सबक सिखाती है। तो अब आप देखें इनकी बुनियादी कहानी, इनका स्ट्रक्चर, इनकी ज़ुबान कुछ ज़रा ज़्यादा मुश्किल उर्दू में है, कुछ बहुत रवानी से हैं, बिल्कुल मुख्तलिफ है, बिल्कुल एक तरह की टाइप कास्ट कहानी नहीं है। और ये भी 6 हैं, 6 साल मज़ीद नए आएंगे और उनका तर्जुमा भी आएगा और उससे अगले साल भी। सो इट्स अ वेरी डाइवर्स पूल ऑफ स्टोरीज़ इज़ व्हाट आई वांटेड टू एंड आई ऑल्सो वॉन्टेड टू गेट यू इंटरेस्टेड बिकॉज आई एम होपिंग कि लोग ये जब देखें और सुने तो सिर्फ देख के इसको आगे ना बढ़ जाएं, इनको ख़रीदें, क्योंकि ये प्रोजेक्ट किसी ने कॉर्पोरेट सोशल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी से फ़ंड किया है, लेकिन ये सारी गुफ्तगू फारिग है जब तक लोग किताब ख़रीदने का कल्चर दोबारा पैदा नहीं करते.
Thank you. Now, I would like to talk a bit about one particular qissa that is quite a favorite of mine, and that's the qissa of Azhar Shah and Saman Rukh Bano. Without giving the story away, because that would be such a crime, I'll just say that in that qissa, I mean, I love it for the thoughts that it inspired in me, because it reminded me of how we've wandered away from ourselves as a people and as a literary people. अब उस किस्से में ये होता है, I mean, this is just a basic premise which you'll find in the blurb as well. There's a woman, Saman Rukh Bano, who's sick. I mean, she's been poisoned, and no medicine can cure her. But there's only one treatment, one cure, one medicine that is available, and that will do the trick, and that's listening to stories. So when stories are narrated to her, she starts regaining her health. So अब structure देखें इस किस्से का, it's a story within a story, frame narrative है, वही अलिफ लैला वाली चीज़. So I just started thinking about how fundamental, I mean, fantasy has played such a founding role in our literary tradition. I mean, Dastan le lein, Hoshruba le lein, I mean, it just goes on and on. And it's not just in our part of the world, but theek hai, let's talk about the West as well. Wahan pe bhi, I mean, with French literature, that really played a big role in medieval literature, in the Renaissance as well. Romance of the Rose by the French, Guillaume de Loris, it was a dream vision, a dream allegory, and that really laid the foundation for what Chaucer even wrote about, you know. So just look at this. I mean, fantasy, and it makes sense because that is the artistic instinct. You have to go beyond what's in front of you. That is why मुझे realism से सख्त नफरत है. I'm sorry, सख्त नफरत है. You know, and even the whole naturalist school of thinking. Naturalism जो भी था philosophy में, art में, हर जगह. It was this theory that, you know, men and women, they are a product of their social order. There's no escaping it, really, you know. So, I mean, that just, it defies your intelligence, sort of. But anyway, back to the point on fantasy, that imaginative impulse is so crucial and so fundamental to literature. And I feel it's something we've really moved away from. As, you know, Musharraf was saying, it's a connection we lost. Why? Osama, what would you say? Why?
So I think modernity, our sort of unquestioning embracing of modernity as something which is superior. And this is not just us. This happened post the Ottoman Empire. This has happened in various parts of the world which were militarily defeated. The defeat was also transformed into a political, a cultural, a literary defeat. If you read Kai Chand The Sare Asma, शम्सुर रहमान फारूकी साहब का नॉवल, उनका तो बुनियादी थीसिस जो मैं समझाऊं वो है ही ये कि अगर आप पॉलिटिकली डिसइंटीग्रेट कर गए थे, इसका ये मतलब नहीं था कि आप सिविलाइजेशनली डिसइंटीग्रेट कर गए, बल्कि सिविलाइजेशन तो उस वक्त आपकी अपने उरूज पे थी. लेकिन हमें किस तरह से कॉलोनियल टेक्स्ट के अंदर दिखाया जाता है कि वो जो थे वो सारा मोहम्मद शाह रंगीला और ये और वो, हालांकि सम ऑफ द फाइनेस्ट पोइट्री. So I think that's a very significant book in that regard. And the reason why fantasy is important, quite apart from the excellent points you made, I may just add one other to it. Fantasy is also the realm of experimentation and irreverence, which are both important for a society. क्योंकि जब आप बिल्कुल एक realistic trope में आ जाते हैं ना, तो वो फिर आप कोई alternative नहीं suggest कर सकते. फिर तो वो कानून की ज़ुबान बन जाती है, हालांकि कानून की ज़ुबान भी बड़ी dexterous है. और दूसरी बात ये कि इर्रेवरेंस बहुत ज़रूरी है. जब आप एक ऐसे माशरे में रह रहे हैं जहाँ पे पाबंदी है बोलने पे, तो फिर आप कहानी के ज़रिए जो है उसको इस्तेमाल करते हैं. मैंने अपने नावल में बल्कि एक किरदार ऐसा क्रिएट किया जो मेरी इमेजिनेशन से था कि वो 1857 में अंग्रेज़ों के ख़िलाफ़ वरगलाने के लिए जो ज़ुबान इस्तेमाल कर रहा है वो दास्तान गोई है। चूँकि देखें जो मेटाफर ईवल का है और हेजेमनी का है वो तो सारा उधर भी है। सो आई थिंक इसका रिमार्केबल ये है। सो आई थिंक हमें मॉडर्निटी को एम्ब्रेस करना है, चूँकि हम उसको रिजेक्ट भी नहीं कर सकते, लेकिन मॉडर्निटी को किस तरह से एम्ब्रेस करना है एक बहुत बड़ा सवाल है। हमारे आर्किटेक्चर को देखें, आज से 60-70 साल पहले का आर्किटेक्चर देखें, इधर की आबो हवा के मुताबिक है और खूबसूरत है। अब वो आबो हवा के मुताबिक भी नहीं और बदसूरत भी है। सो दैट्स द लार्जर बैटल।
Musharraf, I would love to hear your take on that, but one more thing I want to add. Another term I detest, and that's genre fiction. And I think, I mean, of course, that's a modern construct. You've got genre fiction, you've got literary fiction, you've got speculative fiction. So again, I would say these demarcations are responsible for a lot of literature all over the world moving away from a spontaneous impulse. Because, I mean, this involves pigeonholing. It involves segregating reading communities as well. Oh, Falah reads YA, Falah reads fantasy. I'm not into speculative fiction. I like literary fiction. They don't make any sense, these distinctions. You know?
Or South Asian fiction, or
the worst.
You know,
that's the worst category.
Commonwealth fiction.
Yes. So, Musharraf, you're smiling, so please share your thoughts.
I have two things to say. One slightly connects with your earlier remark about the role of fantasy in reality. If you look at this qissa of Azar Shah and Saman Ruhbano, the stories narrated, the story which is a fantastic story, is narrated to somebody who is lying sick as a cure. So fantasy heals us. Story as a story, it allows our mind to make those synapses, those connections, which have been broken, which have been wounded for whatever reason, and it shows fantasy playing a role in mending that and healing us. Regarding your other remark about pigeonholing literature and genres, another thing that is not as often talked about is demarcation, the greater demarcation that exists between adult literature and children's literature. There was a time when no such distinction existed, and you wrote a story, and the story was good, it was enjoyed across the age groups. But now a very narrower interpretation of children's literature is given. So, and if you look at human beings, you grow as a child reading something, and as you grow older, you add more things to your experience, your knowledge, your taste changes. You start liking your palate depths to different kinds of tastes, and starts enjoying them. Something that you probably hated as a child, adrak in my case, which I now love, and can't have enough of it in my food. So things like that. Yes, this is a problem in publishing, this demarcation, this segregation, these boundaries, and the nature of publishing and how it works as an industry is also displayed in how people are segregated. Publishing houses specializing in Black literature, for example, or Spanish literature. So, these are or Latino American literature. So these are problems we have to solve as readers and writers, so that we at least people know that there is a group of writers and readers who think that this is very silly.
Thank you. So I believe we only have around 4 minutes, so we have to wind up. If you have any questions, this is your time. I would like to end my bit, unless Osama would like to add something. I want to talk a bit about Farkhanda, because the Qissa of Farkhanda, because that is it's a story I really enjoyed reading. Okay, how should I put it? The end of the qissa was so surprising, but in a way it was so predictable, because in the introduction, Musharraf writes that the original author, the supposed author of the qissa, was a woman. But we don't know her name, we don't know who she was. Women contributed a lot to qissa literature, but they're completely wiped out from history because, you know, that's just the system. So then a man stepped in, compiled, put this qissa together, and, you know, the qissa bears his authorial name. So, Musharraf, how would you make sense of that discrepancy or that dichotomy in the unity of the plot?
So as I say in my preface that this is all conjecture, but this conjecture is based on the internal evidence from the story. How a woman might look at certain things, and by that I do not at all mean that a man cannot be sympathetic enough to think from the mind of a woman. That is not the intention, but there are certain things which make me think that I mean, if I can point to a couple of stories, I would say that this story is one which was probably written by a woman. For me, even though we have a slightly different interpretation of whether the woman has to follow the line of patriarchy as you mentioned, or in my case, she had a bigger aim, a more self-serving interest, which allowed her to accept those terms and continue with those, because she always wanted a certain higher power and upper hand in her relationships with the king. So this is my interpretation, but you know, this is the beauty of stories. We can present them, and people are free to make their own judgment and their own interpretation of the stories. I fully agree with your interpretation while subscribing to my own idea. Because as readers, as writers, we have that space and we have that freedom. And I think that's all there is to be said about different interpretations for these stories.
Yeah, I like that very much. Your judgment is your own. So thank you, Musharraf. Thank you, Osama. And thank you for the technical support, really. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Khudafis.
Thank you.